a quick reload. Yo, so it just turned 10, and, well, I have this, little program in my phone that in order to, get myself to not doom scroll in bed, it just blocks all the apps, and that includes the camera. So, it didn't give me a sound, so thank God, I was looking at the phone right at 10, because I saw the little light, the little phone screen just dim precipitously for no apparent reason, and I just knew my time had come. So we switched out for the old phone, and we're going to continue. But surely it was the most sublime moment of my clinical life to have watched that voyage in reverse, to encounter men and women returning from the strange country, to see them so very close, clambering back. So little to say until another break. These phone interruptions happen at the worst times. It's just a few sentences away from a break, so whatever. It's break time. How long until? Okay, so 1, 2, 3 and a half. My God. Incremental advances. Oh, right. Why am I so forgetful when we have the most important thing to do? Hey, let me do a boom. Struck it with the meat of my hands. You could probably see it ricocheting that one. Okay, just adjusting my contacts. Alright. Incremental advances can add up to transformative changes. In 2005, an avalanche of papers cascading through the scientific literature converged on a remarkably consistent message. The national physiognomy of cancer has suddenly but fundamentally changed. The mortality for nearly every major form of cancer, lung, breast, colon, and prostate, had continuously dropped for 15 straight years. There had been no single drastic turn, but rather a steady and powerful attrition. Mortality had declined by about 1% every year. The rate might sound modest, but its cumulative effect was remarkable. Between 1990 and 2005, the cancer-specific death rate had dropped nearly 15%, a decline unprecedented in the history of the disease. The empire of cancer was still undoubtedly vast. More than 500,000 American men and women died of cancer in 2005, but it was losing power, fraying at the borders. What precipitated this steady decline? There was no single answer, but rather a multitude. For lung cancer, the driver of decline was primarily prevention, a slow attrition and smoking sparked by the Dahlhill and Vinter-Graham studies, fueled by the Surgeon General's report, and brought to its full boil by a combination of political activism, inventive litigation, medical advocacy, and countermarketing. For colon and cervical cancer, the declines were almost certainly due to the successes of secondary prevention, cancer screening, cancer screening. Colon cancers were detected at earlier and earlier stages in their evolution, often in the pre-malignant stages, and treated with relatively minor surgeries. Cervical cancer screenings using Papa Nicolau smearing techniques were being offered at primary care centers throughout the nation. And as with colon cancer, pre-malignant lesions were excised using relatively minor surgeries. For leukemia, lymphoma, and testicular cancer, in contrast, the declining numbers reflected the successes of chemotherapeutic treatment. In childhood ALL, cure rates of 80% were routinely being achieved. Hodgkin's disease was similarly curable, and so too were some large-cell aggressive lymphomas. Indeed, for Hodgkin's disease, testicular cancer, and childhood leukemias, the burning question was not how much chemotherapy was curative, but how little. Trials were addressing whether milder and less toxic doses of drugs, scaled back from the original protocols, could achieve equivalent cure rates. Perhaps most symbolically, the decline in breast cancer mortality epitomized the cumulative and collaborative nature of these victories, and the importance of attacking cancer using multiple independent prongs. Between 1990 and 2005, breast cancer mortality had dwindled an unprecedented 24%. These interventions had potentially driven down the breast cancer death rate. Mammography, surgery, and adjuvant chemotherapy, three interventions had potentially driven down the breast cancer death rate. Mammography, or screening to catch early breast cancer and thereby prevent invasive breast cancer, surgery, and adjuvant chemotherapy, or that is chemotherapy after surgery, to remove remnant cancer cells. Donald Berry, a statistician in Houston, Texas, set out to answer a controversial question. How much had mammography and chemotherapy independently contributed to survival? Whose victory was this? A victory of prevention or of therapeutic intervention? Berry's answer was a long-due emollient to a feud beset by squabbles between the advocates of prevention and the proponents of chemotherapy. When Berry assessed the effect of each intervention independently using statistical models, it was a satisfying tie. Both cancer prevention and chemotherapy had diminished breast cancer mortality equally, 12% for mammography and 12% for chemotherapy, adding up to the observed 24% reduction in mortality. No one, as Berry said, paraphrasing the Bible, had labored in vain. That's our last break, and my throat is actually very hurting, as with the roof of my mouth. Hell yeah. I need to drink some bloody water, man. Wonderful stuff. These were all deep, audacious, and meaningful victories born on the backs of deep and meaningful labors. But in truth, they were the victories of another generation, the results of discoveries made in the 50s and 60s. The core conceptual advances from which these treatment strategies arose predated nearly all the significant work on the cell biology of cancer. In the bewildering spurt over just 2 decades, scientists had unveiled a fantastical new world of errant oncogenes and tumor suppressor genes that accelerated and decelerated growth to unleash cancer, of chromosomes that could be decapitated and translocated to create new genetic chimeras, of cellular pathways corrupted to subvert the death of cancer. But the therapeutic advances that had led to the slow attrition of cancer mortality made no use of this novel biology of cancer. There was new science on one hand, and old medicine on the other. Mary Lasker had once searched for an epochal shift in cancer, but that shift that had occurred seemed to belong to another epoch. Mary Lasker died of heart failure in 1994 in a carefully curated home in Connecticut, having removed herself physically from the bristling epicenters of cancer research and policymaking in Washington, New York, and Boston. She was 93 years old. Her life had nearly spanned the most the most transformative and turbulent century of biomedical science. Her potent ebullience had dimmed in her last decade. She spoke rarely about the achievements or disappointments of the war on cancer. But she had expected cancer medicine to have achieved more during her lifetime, to have taken a more assertive step towards Farber's universal cure for cancer, and marked a more definitive victory in the war. The complexity, the tenacity, the sheer magisterial force of cancer had made even its most committed and resolute opponent seem circumspect and humbled. In 1994, a few months after Lasker's death, the cancer geneticist Ed Harlow captured both the agony and the ecstasy of the era. At the end of a week-long conference at this Cold Spring Harbor laboratory in New York, pervaded by a giddy sense of anticipation about the spectacular achievements of cancer biology, Harlow delivered a sobering assessment. Our knowledge of molecular defects in cancer has come from a dedicated 20 years of the best molecular biology research. Yet this information does not translate to any effective treatments, nor to any understanding of why many of the current treatments succeed or why others fail. It is a frustrating time. More than a decade later, I could sense the same frustration in the clinic at Mass General. One afternoon, I watched Tom Lynch, the lung cancer clinician, masterfully encapsulate carcinogenesis, cancer genetics, and chemotherapy for a new patient, a middle-aged woman with bronchoalveolar cell cancer. She was a professor of history with a grave manner and a sharp, darting mind. He sat across from her, scribbling a picture as he spoke. The cells in her bronchus, he began, had acquired mutations in their genes that had allowed them to grow autonomously and uncontrollably. They had formed a local tumor. Their propensity was to acquire further mutations that might allow them to migrate, to invade tissues, to metastasize. Chemotherapy with carboplatin and Taxol, two standard chemotherapy drugs, augmented with radiation, would kill the cells and perhaps prevent them from migrating to other organisms to seed metastases. In the best case scenario, the cells carrying the mutated genes would die and their cancer would be cured. She watched Lynch put his pen down with her quick, sharp eyes. The explanation sounded logical and organized, but she had caught the glint of a broken piece in the chain of logic. What was the connection between this explanation and the theory being proposed? How, she wanted to know, would carboplatin fix her mutated genes? How would Taxol know which cells carried the mutations in order to kill them? How would the mechanistic explanation of her illness connect with the medical interventions? She had captured the disjunction all too familiar to oncologists. For nearly a decade, practicing cancer medicine had become like living inside a pressurized can, pushed on one hand by the increasing force of biological clarity about cancer, but then pressed against the wall of medical stagnation that seemed to have produced no real medicine out of this biological clarity. In the winter of 1945, Vannevar Bush had written to President Roosevelt, "The striking advances in medicine during the war have been possible only because we had a large backlog of scientific data accumulated through basic research in many scientific fields in the years before the war." For cancer, the backlog of scientific data had reached a critical point. The boil of science, as Bush liked to imagine it, inevitably produced a kind of steam, an urgent, rhapsodic pressure that could only find release in technology. Cancer science was begging to find release in a new kind of cancer medicine. Oh, man. Okay. Let's go forward. Oh, yes, that was the end of a chapter. You know what that means. 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 That wasn't that good. Yeah, whatever. Okay. Ugh. New drugs for old cancers. This is the next chapter, and we have 2 quotes. In the story of Patroclus, no one survives, not even Achilles. He was nearly a god. Patroclus resembled him. They wore the same armor. And that is by Louise Gluck. Patroclus. I seem to have forgotten how to pronounce his name. Patroclus. Oh no. Everything sounds wrong. Whatevs. The perfect therapy has not been developed. Most of us believe that it will not involve toxic cytotoxic therapy, which is why we support the kinds of basic investigations that are directed towards more fundamental understanding of tumor biology. But we must do the best with what we have now. And that is from Bruce Chabner to Rose Kushner. In the legend, Achilles was quickly dipped into the river Styx, held up only by the tendon of his heel. Touched by the dark sheath of water, every part of his body was instantly rendered impervious to even the most lethal weapon, except the undipped tendon. A single arrow targeted to that vulnerable hero would eventually kill Achilles in the battlefields of Troy. Before the 1980s, the armamentariums of cancer therapy were largely built around 2 fundamental vulnerabilities of cancer cells. The first is that most cancers originate as local diseases before they spread systematically. Surgery and radiation therapy exploit this vulnerability. By physically excising locally restricted tumors before cancer cells can spread, or by searing cancer cells with localized bursts of powerful energy using X-rays, surgery and radiation attempt to eliminate cancer en bloc from the body. The second vulnerability is the rapid growth rate of some cancer cells. Most chemotherapy drugs discovered before the 1980s target this second vulnerability. Antifolates, such as Farber's aminopterin, interrupt that metabolism of folic acid and starve all cells of a crucial nutrient required for cell division. Nitrogen mustard and cisplatin chemically react with DNA, and DNA-damaged cells cannot duplicate their genes and thus cannot divide. Vincristine, the periwinkle poison, thwarts the ability of a cell to construct the molecular scaffold required for all cells to divide. But these 2 traditional Achilles heels of cancer, local growth and rapid cell division, can only be targeted to a point. Surgery and radiation are intrinsically localized strategies, and they fail when cancer cells have spread beyond the limits of what can be surgically removed or irradiated. More surgery does not lead to more cures, and the radical surgeons discovered this to their despair in the 1950s. Targeting cellular growth also hits out at the biological ceiling because normal cells must grow as well. Growth may be the hallmark of cancer, but is equally the hallmark of life. A poison directed at cellular growth, such as vincristine or cisplatin, eventually attacks normal growth, and cells that grow most rapidly in the body begin to bear the collateral cost of the chemotherapy. Hair falls out, blood involutes, the lining of the skin and gut sloughs off. More drugs produce more toxicity without producing cures, as the radical chemotherapists discover to their despair in the 1980s. To target cancer cells with novel therapies, scientists and physicians needed new vulnerabilities that were unique to cancer. The discoveries of cancer biology in the 1980s offered a vastly more nuanced view of these vulnerabilities. 3 new principles emerged, representing 3 new Achilles heels of cancer. First, cancer cells are driven to grow because of the accumulation of mutations in their DNA. These mutations activate internal proto-oncogenes and inactivate tumor suppressor genes, thus unleashing the accelerators or brakes that operate during normal cell division. Targeting these hyperactive genes or sparing their modulated normal precursors might be a novel means to attack cancer cells more discriminately. Second, proto-oncogenes and tumor suppressor genes typically lie at the hub of cellular signaling pathways. Cancer cells divide and grow because they are driven by hyperactive or inactive signals in these critical pathways. These pathways exist in normal cells but are tightly regulated. The potential dependence of a cancer cell on such permanently activated pathways is a second potential vulnerability of a cancer cell. Third, the relentless cycle of mutation, selection, and survival creates a cancer cell that has acquired several additional properties besides an uncontrolled growth. These include the capacity to resist death signals, to metastasize throughout the body, and to incite the growth of blood vessels. These hallmarks of cancer are not invented by the cancer cell. They are typically derived from the corruption of similar processes that occur in the normal physiology of the body. The acquired dependence of a cancer cell on these processes is a third potential vulnerability of cancer. The central therapeutic challenge of the newest cancer medicine was to find, among the vast numbers of similarities in normal cells and cancer cells, subtle differences in genes, pathways, and acquired capabilities, and to derive a poisonous stake into that new heel. Well, we 1.5, 2, no, 1.5, 2.5, 3.5, 4.5 pages to go. I missed. That was a stupid one. That was a wimpy one. That was a dog shit one. That was a retarded one. I'm kidding. That was not a retarded one. Oh, that was big and strong and girthy. Alright. It was one thing to identify an Achilles heel, and quite another to discover a weapon that would strike it. Until the late 1980s, no drug had reversed an oncogene's activation or a tumor suppressor's inactivation. Even tamoxifen, the most specific cancer-targeted drug discovered to that date, works by attacking the dependence of certain breast cancer cells on estrogen, and not by directly inactivating an oncogene or oncogene-activated pathway. In 1986, the discovery of the first oncogene-targeted drug would thus instantly galvanize cancer medicine. Although found largely serendipitously, the mere existence of such a molecule would set the stage for the vast drug-hunting efforts of the next decade. Good shit, we're still recording. The fact that this screen is not so bright makes me very worried, because I can't tell whether this has closed or not. And you saw with the last few vlogs, it does have a tendency to close because this phone case is quite unstable and like literally falling to pieces. The disease that stood at the pivotal crossroads of oncology was yet another rare variant of leukemia called acute promyelocytic leukemia, or APL. First identified as a distinct form of adult leukemia in the 1950s, the disease has a distinct characteristic. The cells in this form of cancer do not merely divide rapidly, they are also strikingly frozen in immature development. Normal white blood cells developing in the bone marrow undergo a series of maturational steps to develop into fully functional adult cells. One such intermediate cell is termed a promyelocyte, an adolescent cell on the verge of becoming functionally mature. APL is characterized by the malignant proliferation of these immature promyelocytes. Normal promyelocytes are loaded with toxic enzymes and granules that are typically released by adult white blood cells to kill virus, bacteria, and parasites. In promyelocytic leukemia, the blood fills up with these toxin-loaded promyelocytes. Moody, mercurial, and jumpy, the cells of APL can release these poisonous granules on a whim, precipitating massive bleeding or simulating a septic reaction in the body. In APL, the pathological proliferation of cancer thus comes with a fiery twist. Most cancers contain cells that refuse to stop growing. In APL, the cancer cells also refuse to grow up. So they should have just called it Peter Pan disease. accepted in the blood. The bloody Peter Pan disease. Since the early 1970s, this maturation arrest of APL cells had prompted scientists to hunt for a chemical that might force these cells to mature. Scores of drugs had been tested on APL cells in test tubes, and only one had stood out: retinoic acid, an oxidized form of vitamin A. But retinoic acid, researchers had found, was a vexingly unreliable reagent. One batch of the acid might mature APL cells, while another batch of the same chemical might fail. Frustrated by these flickering, unfathomable responses, biologists and chemists had turned away after their initial enthusiasm for the maturation chemical. Alright. In the summer of 1985, a team of leukemia researchers from China traveled to France to meet Laurent Degos, a hematologist at St. Louis Hospital in Paris with a long-standing interest in APL. The Chinese team, led by Zhenyi Wang, was also treating APL patients at Ruijin Hospital, a busy urban clinical center in Shanghai, China. Both Degos and Wang had tried standard chemotherapy agents, drugs that target rapidly growing cells to promote remissions in APL patients, but the results had been dismal. Wang and Degos spoke of the need for a new strategy to attack this whimsical lethal disease, and they kept circling back to the peculiar immaturity of APL cells and to the lapsed search for a maturation agent for the disease. Retinoic acid, Wang and Degos knew, comes in two closely related molecular forms, called cis-retinoic acid and trans-retinoic acid. The two forms are compositionally identical, but possess a slight difference in their molecular structure, and they behave very differently in molecular reactions. Of the two forms, cis-retinoic acid has been the most intensively tested, and it had produced a flickering transient responses. But Wang and Degos wondered if trans-retinoic acid was the true maturation agent. Had the unreliable responses in the old experiments been due to a low and variable amount of the trans-retinoic form present in every batch of retinoic acid? Wang, who had studied at a French Jesuit school in Shanghai, spoke a lilting, heavily accented French. Linguistic and geographic barriers breached, the two hematologists outlined an international collaboration. Wang knew of a pharmaceutical factory outside Shanghai that could produce pure trans-retinoic acid without the admixture of cis-retinoic acid. He would test the drug on APL patients at the Ruijin Hospital. Degos' team and patients would follow after the initial round of testing in China and further validate the strategy on French APL patients. Wang launched his trial in 1986 with 24 patients. 23 experienced a dazzling response. Leukemic promyelocytes in the blood underwent a brisk maturation into white blood cells. The nucleus became larger, Wang wrote, and fewer primary granules were observed in the cytoplasm. On the fourth day of culture, these cells gave rise to myelocytes containing specific or secondary granules, indicating the development of fully mature granulocytes. Then something even more unexpected occurred. Having fully matured, the cancer cells began to die out. In some patients, the differentiation and deaths erupted so volcanically that the bone marrow swelled up with differentiated promyelocytes and then emptied slowly over weeks as the cancer cell matured and underwent an accelerated cycle of death. The sudden maturation of cancer cells produced a short-lived metabolic disarray, which was controlled with medicines, but the only other side effect of trans-retinoic acid were dryness of lips and mouth and an occasional rash. That's what I have. Am I on trans-retinoic acid? Do I have this APL cancer? Oh shit. I'm kidding. The remissions produced by transretinoic acid last weeks and even months. Acute promyelocystic leukemia still relapsed, typically about 3 to 4 months after treatment with transretinoic acid. The Paris and Shanghai teams next combined standard chemotherapy drugs with transretinoic acid, a cocktail of old and new drugs, and remissions were prolonged by several additional months. In about 3/4 of the patients, the leukemia remission began to stretch into a full year, and then 5 years. By 1993, Wong and Dagos concluded that 75% of their patients treated with a combination of transretinoic acid and standard chemotherapy would never relapse, a percentage unheard of in the history of APL. Cancer biologists would need another decade to explain the startling routine responses at a molecular level. The key to the explanation lay in the elegant studies performed by Janet Rowley, the Chicago cytologist. In 1984, Rowley had identified a unique translocation in the chromosomes of APL cells, a fragment of a gene from chromosome 15 fused with a fragment of a gene from chromosome 17. This created an activated chimeric oncogene that drove the proliferation of promyelocytes and blocked their maturation, thus creating the peculiar syndrome of APL. In 1990, a full 4 years after Wong's clinical trial in Shanghai, this culprit oncogene was isolated by independent teams of scientists from France, Italy, and America. The APL oncogene, scientists found, encodes a protein that is tightly bound by transretinoic acid. This binding immediately extinguishes the oncogene signal in APL cells, thereby explaining the rapid, powerful remissions observed in Shanghai. And that's a break. Oh, my neck. That was metallic in sound. Come on. Oh. Wonderful piece. The Roux-gene discovery was remarkable. Transretinoic acid represented a long-sought fantasy of molecular oncology, an oncogene-targeted chemical cancer drug. But the discovery was a fantasy lived backwards. Wong and Dagos had first stumbled on transretinoic acid through inspired guesswork, and only later discovered that the molecule could directly target an oncogene. But was it possible to make the converse journey, starting from oncogene and going to drug? Indeed, Robert Weinberg's lab in Boston had already begun that converse journey, although Weinberg himself was largely oblivious of it. By the early 1980s, Weinberg's lab had perfected a technique to isolate cancer-causing genes directly out of cancer cells. Using Weinberg's techniques, researchers had isolated dozens of new oncogenes from cancer cells. In 1982, a postdoctoral student from Bombay working in Weinberg's lab, Lakshmi Karan Padhi, reported the isolation of yet another such oncogene from a rat tumor called a neuroblastoma. Weinberg christened the gene NEW, naming it after the type of cancer that harbored this gene. NEW was added to the growing list of oncogenes, but it was an anomaly. Cells are bounded by a thin membrane of lipids and proteins that acts as an oily barrier against the entry of many drugs. Most oncogenes discovered thus far, such as RAS and MYC, are sequestered inside the cell. RAS is bound to the cell membrane but phases into the cell, making them inaccessible to drugs that cannot penetrate the cell membrane. The product of the new gene, in contrast, was a novel protein, not hidden deep inside the cell, but tethered to the cell membrane with a large fragment that hung outside, freely accessible to any drug. Lakshmi Karan Padhi even had a drug to test. In 1981, while isolating his gene, he had created an antibody against the new protein. Antibodies are molecules designed to bind to other molecules, and the binding can occasionally block and inactivate the bound protein. But antibodies are unable to cross the cell membrane and need an exposed protein outside the cell to bind. Nu, then, was a perfect target, with a large portion, a long molecular foot, projected tantalizingly outside the cell membrane. It would have taken probably no more than an afternoon's experiment to add a new antibody to the neuroblastoma to determine the binding's effect. It would have been an overnight test, Weinberg would later recall. I can flagellate myself. If I had been more studious and more focused and not as monomaniacal about the ideas I had at the time, I would have made that connection. Despite the trail of seductive leads, Brody and Weinberg never got around to doing that experiment. Afternoon upon afternoon passed. Introspective and bookish, Polly shuffled through the lab in a threadbare coat during the winter, running his experiments privately and saying little about them to others. And although Proddy's discovery was published in a high-profile scientific journal, few scientists noticed that he might have stumbled on a potential anti-cancer drug. Even Weinberg, caught in the giddy upswirl of new oncogenes and obsessed with the basic biology of the cancer cell, simply forgot about the new experiment. Weinberg had an oncogene and possibly an oncogene blocking drug, but the twain had never met. In the neuroblastoma cells dividing in his incubators, Nu rampaged on monomaniacally, single-mindedly, seemingly invincible, yet its molecular foot still waved just outside the surface of the plasma membrane, exposed and vulnerable, like Achilles' famous heel. Achilles' famous heel. No famouses, what the hell? Alright. Changing my setup. Good shit. Right. And it's a new chapter, so. Boom. It's like celebrating the new year. Except it happens every 30 minutes. Tried so hard to not to show you my underwears, but I guess that one just did it for me. Alright. That one's better. It's a bit blurry. Yeah, I put you against the letter A. That's fine. Alright. A City of Strings is the next chapter. And there's just one quote. In Ercilia, to establish the relationships that sustain the city's life, inhabitants stretch strings from the corners of the houses, white or black or gray or black and white, according to whatever they mark a relationship of blood, of trade, authority, agency. Or according to whether they mark a relationship of blood, of trade, authority, agency. When the strings become so numerous that you can no longer pass among them, the inhabitants leave. The houses are dismantled. That's very cool. I need to drink some water because my throat is currently killing me. And my mouth is currently killing me. And both have good reason to try to do so. I'm gonna aim to get like 55 more pages done, because we're at page 412 right now. We gotta get to at least 470. Okay. Weinberg may have briefly forgotten about the therapeutic implication of new, but oncogenes, by their very nature, could not easily be forgotten. In his book Invisible Cities, Italo Calvino describes a fictional metropolis in which every relationship between one household and the next is denoted by a piece of colored string stretched between the two houses. As the metropolis grows, the mesh of strings thickens, and the individual houses blur away. In the end, Calvino's cities become no more than an interwoven network of colored strings. If someone were to draw a similar map of relationships among genes in a normal human cell, then proto-oncogenes and tumor suppressors such as ROS, MYC, NU, and RB would sit at the hub of the cellular city, radiating webs of colored strings in every direction. Proto-oncogenes and tumor suppressors are the molecular pivots of the cell. They are the gatekeepers of cell division, and the division of cells is so central to our physiology that genes and pathways that coordinate this process intersect with nearly every other aspect of our biology. In the laboratory, we call this the 6 degrees of separation from cancer rule. You can ask any biological question, no matter how seemingly distant. What makes the heart fail? Why do worms age? How do birds learn songs? And you will end up in fewer than 6 genetic steps, connecting with the proto-oncogene or tumor suppressor. It should hardly come as a surprise, then, that NU was barely forgotten in Weinberg's laboratory when it was resurrected in another. In the summer of 1984, a team of researchers collaborating with Weinberg discovered the human homologue of the NU gene, noting its resemblance to another growth-modulating gene discovered previously, the human EGF receptor, or HER. The researchers called the gene HER2. A gene by any other name may still be the same gene, but something crucial had shifted in the story of NU. Weinberg's gene had been discovered in an academic laboratory. Much of Weinberg's attention had been focused on dissecting the molecular mechanism of the NU oncogene. HER2, in contrast, was discovered on the sprawling campus of the pharmaceutical company Genentech. The difference in venue and the resulting difference in goals would radically alter the fate of this gene. For Weinberg, NU had represented a route to understanding the fundamental biology of neuroblastoma. For Genentech, HER2 represented a route to developing a new drug. Located on the southern edge of San Francisco, sandwiched among the powerhouse labs of Stanford, UCSF, and Berkeley, and the burgeoning startups of Silicon Valley, Genentech, short for Genetic Engineering Technology, was born out of an idea imbued with deep alchemical symbolism. Oh shit. I just steamrolled past the break there. Give me a second, we gotta do the thing. Alright. Sorry about that. Let's keep going. In the late 1970s, researchers at Stanford and UCSF had invented a terminology called recombinant DNA. This technology allowed genes to be manipulated or engineered in a hitherto unimaginable manner. Genes could be shuttled from one organism to another. A cow gene could be transferred into bacteria, or a human protein synthesized in dog cells. Genes could also be spliced together to create new genes, creating proteins never found in nature. Genentech imagined leveraging this technology of genes to develop a pharmacopoeia of novel drugs. Founded in 1976, the company licensed recombinant DNA technology from UCSF, raised a paltry $200,000 in venture funds, and launched its hunt for these novel drugs. A drug, in bare conceptual terms, is any substance that can produce an effect on the physiology of an animal. Drugs can be simple molecules. Water and salt, under appropriate conditions, can function as potent pharmacological agents. Or drugs can be complex, multifaceted chemicals, molecules derived from nature, such as penicillin, or chemicals synthesized artificially, such as aminopterin. Among the most complex drugs in medicine are proteins, molecules synthesized by cells that can exert diverse effects on human physiology. Insulin, made by pancreas cells, is a protein that regulates blood sugar and can be used to control diabetes. Growth hormone, made by the pituitary cells, augments growth by increasing the metabolism of muscle and bone cells. Before Genentech, protein drugs, although recognizably potent, had been notoriously difficult to produce. Insulin, for instance, was produced by grinding up cow and pig innards into a soup and then extracting the protein from the mix. 1 pound of insulin for every 8,000 pounds of pancreas. Growth hormone, used to treat a form of dwarfism, was extracted from pituitary glands dissected out of thousands of human cadavers. Clotting drugs to create bleeding disorders came from liters of human blood. Recombinant DNA technology allowing Genentech to synthesize human proteins de novo. Rather than extracting proteins from animal and human organs, Genentech could engineer a human gene into a bacterium and use the bacterial cell as a bioreactor to produce vast quantities of that protein. The technology was transformative. In 1982, Genentech unveiled the first recombinant human insulin. In 1984, it produced a clotting factor used to control bleeding in patients with hemophilia. In 1985, it created a recombinant version of human growth hormone, all created by engineering the production of human proteins in bacterial or animal cells. By the late 1980s, though, after an astonishing growth spurt, Genentech ran out of existing drugs to mass produce using recombinant technology. Its early victories, after all, had been the result of a process and not a product. The company had found a radical new way to produce old medicines. Now, as Genentech set out to invent new drugs from scratch, it was forced to change its winning strategy. It needed to find targets for drugs, proteins and cells that might play a critical role in the physiology of a disease that might, in turn, be turned on and off by other proteins produced using recombinant DNA. It was under the aegis of this target discovery program that Axel Ulrich, a German scientist working at Genentech, rediscovered Weinberg's gene, HER2/neu, the oncogene tethered to the cell membrane. But having discovered the gene, Genentech did not know what to do with it. The drugs that Genentech had successfully synthesized thus far were designed to treat human diseases, in which a protein or a signal was absent or low. Insulin for diabetes, clotting factors for hemophiliacs, growth hormones for dwarfs. An oncogene was the opposite, not a missing signal, but a signal in overabundance. Genentech could fabricate a missing protein in bacterial cells, but it had yet to learn how to inactivate a hyperactive protein in the human cell. That's a break. You know what to do. Slam dunks. Long stretch coming up. It's gonna 1, 2, 3. 3 whole pages. Actually chore. Actually, it's 4 pages. Yeah, it's 4 pages. In the summer of 1986, while Genentech was still puzzling over a method to inactivate oncogenes, Ulrich presented a seminar at the University of California in Los Angeles. Flamboyant and exuberant and dressed in a dark, formal suit, Ulrich was a riveting speaker. He floored his audience with the incredible story of the isolation of HER2 and the serendipitous convergence of that discovery with Weinberg's prior work. But he left his listeners searching for a punchline. Genentech was a drug company. Where was the drug? Dennis Slaman, a UCLA oncologist, attended Ulrich's talk that afternoon in 1986. The son of an Appalachian coal miner, Slaman had come to UCLA as a fellow in oncology after medical school at the University of Chicago. He was a peculiar amalgam of smoothness and tenacity, a velvet jackhammer, as one reporter described him. Early in his academic life, he had acquired what he called a murderous resolve to cure cancer, but thus far it was all resolve and no result. In Chicago, Slaman had performed a series of exquisite studies on human leukemia virus called HTLV-1, the lone retrovirus shown to cause human cancer. But HTLV-1 was a fleetingly rare cause of cancer. Murdering viruses, Slaman knew, would not cure cancer. He needed a method to kill an oncogene. Slaman, hearing Ulrich's story of HER2, made a quick, intuitive connection. Ulrich had an oncogene. Genentech wanted a drug, but an intermediate was missing. A drug without a disease is a useless tool. To make a worthwhile cancer drug, both needed a cancer in which the HER2 gene was hyperactive. Slaman had a panel of cancers that he could test for HER2 hyperactivity. A compulsive pack rat, like Thaddeus in Boston, Slaman had been collecting and storing samples of cancer tissues from patients who had undergone surgery at UCLA, all saved in a vast freezer. Slaman proposed a simple collaboration. If Ulrich sent him the DNA probes for HER2 from Genentech, Slaman could test his collection of cancer cells for samples with hyperactive HER2, thus bridging the gap between the oncogene and the human cancer. Ulrich agreed. In 1986, he sent Slaman the HER2 probe to test on cancer samples. In a few months, Slaman reported back to Ulrich that he had found a distinct pattern, although he did not fully understand it. Cancer cells that become habitually dependent on the activity of a gene for their growth can amplify that gene by making multiple copies of the gene in the chromosome. This phenomenon, like an addict feeding an addiction by ramping up the use of a drug, is called oncogene amplification. HER2, Slaman found, was highly amplified in breast cancer samples, but not in all breast cancers. Based on the pattern of staining, breast cancers could neatly be divided into HER2 amplified and HER2 unamplified samples, HER2 positive and HER2 negative. Puzzled by the on-off pattern, Slaman sent an assistant to determine whether HER2 positive tumors behaved differently from HER2 negative tumors. The search yielded yet another extraordinary pattern. Breast tumors that amplified Ulrich's gene tended to be more aggressive, more metastatic, and more likely to kill. HER2 amplification marked the tumors with the worst prognosis. Slaman's data set off a chain reaction in Ulrich's lab at Genentech. The association of HER2 with a subtype of cancer, aggressive breast cancer, prompted an important experiment. What would happen, Ulrich wondered, if HER2 activity could somehow be shut off? Was the cancer truly addicted to amplified HER2? And if so, might squelching the addiction signal using an anti-HER2 drug block the growth of the cancer cells? Ulrich was already tiptoeing around the afternoon experiment that Weinberg and Patti had forgotten to perform. Ulrich knew where he might look for a drug to shut off HER2 function, By the mid-1980s, Genentech had organized itself into an astonishing simulacrum of a university. The South San Francisco campus had departments, conferences, lectures, subgroups, even researchers in cut-off jeans playing frisbee on the lawns. One afternoon, Ulrich walked to the immunology division at Genentech. The division specialized in the creation of immunological molecules. Ulrich wondered whether someone in immunology could design a drug to bind HER2 and possibly erase its signaling. Ulrich had a particular kind of protein in mind, an antibody. Antibodies are immunological proteins that bind their targets with exquisite affinity and specificity. The immune system synthesizes antibodies to bind and kill specific targets on bacteria and viruses. Antibodies are nature's magic bullets. In the mid-1970s, two immunologists at Cambridge University, Cesar Milstein and George Kohler, had devised a method to produce vast quantities of a single antibody using a hybrid immune cell that had been physically fused into a cancer cell. The immune cell secreted the antibody, while the cancer cell, a specialist in uncontrolled growth, turned it into a factory. But the discovery had instantly been hailed as a potential route to a cancer cure. But to exploit antibodies therapeutically, scientists needed to identify targets unique to cancer cells, and such cancer-specific targets had proved notoriously difficult to identify. Ulrich believed that he had found one such target, HER2, amplified in some breast tumors but barely visible in normal cells, was perhaps Kohler's missing bullseye. At UCLA, meanwhile, Slaman had performed another crucial experiment with HER2-expressing cancers. He had implanted these cancers into mice, where they had exploded into friable metastatic tumors, recapitulating the aggressive human disease. In 1988, Genentech's immunologists successfully produced mouse antibodies that bound and inactivated HER2. Ulrich sent Slaman the first vials of the antibody, and Slaman launched a series of pivotal experiments. When he treated HER2 overexpressing breast cancer cells in a dish with the antibody, the cells stopped growing, then involuted and died. More impressively, when you inject his living tumor-bearing mice with the HER2 antibodies, the tumors also disappeared. It was a perfect result, as he or Ulrich could have hoped for. HER2 inhibition worked on an animal model. Slaman and Ulrich now had all three essential ingredients for a targeted therapy on cancer: an oncogene, or a form of cancer that specifically activated that oncogene, and a drug that specifically targeted it. Both expected Genentech to leap at the opportunity to produce a new protein drug to erase an oncogene's hyperactive signal. But Ulrich, holed away in his lab with HER2, had lost touch with the trajectory of the company outside the lab. Genentech, he now discovered, was abandoning its interest in cancer. Throughout the 1980s, as Ulrich and Slaman had been hunting for a target specific to cancer cells, several other pharmaceutical companies had tried to develop anti-cancer drugs using the limited knowledge of the mechanisms driving the growth of cancer cells. Predictably, the drugs that had emerged were largely indiscriminate, toxic to both cancer and normal cells, and predictably, all had failed miserably in clinical trials. Ulrich and Slaman's approach, an oncogene and an oncogene-targeted antibody, was vastly more sophisticated and specific, but Genentech was worried that pouring money into the development of another drug that failed would cripple the company's finances. Chastened by the experience of others, and allergic to cancer, as one Genentech researcher described it, Genentech piled funding away from most of its cancer projects. The decision created a deep rift in the country. A small cadre of scientists ardently supported the cancer program, but Genentech's executives wanted to focus on simpler and more profitable drugs. HER2 was caught in the crossfire. Drained and dejected, Ulrich left Genentech. He would eventually join an academic laboratory in Germany, where he could work on cancer genetics without the fickle pressures of a pharmaceutical company constraining his science. Schlamann, now working alone at UCLA, tried furiously to keep the HER2 effort alive at Genentech, even though he wasn't on the company's payroll. Nobody gave a shit about him. Nobody gave a shit except him, John Kurd, Genentech's medical director, recalled. Schlamann became a pariah at Genentech, a pushy, obsessed gadfly who would often jet up from Los Angeles and lurk in the corridors seeking to interest anyone he could in his mouse antibody. Most scientists had lost interest, but Schlamann retained the faith of a small group of Genentech scientists nostalgic for the pioneering early days of Genentech when problems had been taken on precisely because they were intractable. Art Levinson, an MIT-educated geneticist, David Botstein, and a molecular biologist, Art Levinson, both at Genentech, had been strong proponents of the HER2 project. Pulling strings, resources, and connections, Schlamann and Levinson convinced a tiny entrepreneurial team to push ahead with the HER2 project. Marginally funded, the work edged along, almost invisible to Genentech's executives. In 1989, Mike Shepard, an immunologist at Genentech, improved the production and purification of the HER2 antibody. But the purified mouse antibody, Schlamann knew, was far from a human drug. Mouse antibodies, being foreign proteins, provoke a potent immune response in humans and make terrible human drugs. To circumvent that response, Genentech's antibody needed to be converted into a protein that more closely resembled a human antibody. This process, evocatively called humanizing an antibody, is a delicate art, somewhat akin to translating a novel. What matters is not just the content, but the ineffable essence of the antibody, its form. Genentech's resident humanizer was Paul Carter, a quiet 29-year-old Englishman who had learned the craft at Cambridge from Cesar Milstein, the scientist who had first produced these antibodies using fused immune and cancer cells. Under Schlamann and Shepard's guidance, Carter set about humanizing the mouse antibody. In the summer of 1990, Carter proudly produced a fully humanized HER2 antibody ready to be used in clinical trials. The antibody, now a potential drug, would soon be renamed Herceptin, using the words HER2, intercept, and inhibitor. Such was the halting, traumatic birth of the new drug that it was easy to forget the enormity of what had been achieved. Schlamann had identified HER2 amplification in breast cancer tissue in 1987. Carter and Shepard had produced a humanized antibody against it in 1990. They had moved from cancer to target to drug in an astonishing 3 years, a pace unprecedented in the history of cancer. That's the last break of this chapter. God damn. Ugh. Oh. I think the way I was sitting all this time was maybe not optimal. Cause, everything in my chest hurts. Oh, fuck. Alright. You know what to do. Ah, fuck, that was not good. Decent, whatever. Ow. the summer of 1990, Barbara Bradfield, a 48-year-old woman from Burbank, California, discovered a mass in her breast and a lump under her arm. A biopsy confirmed what she already suspected. She had breast cancer that had spread to her lymph nodes. She was treated with a bilateral mastectomy followed by nearly 7 months of chemotherapy. When I was finished with all that, she recalled, I felt as if I had crossed a river of tragedy. But there was more river to ford. Bradfield's life was hit by yet another incommensurate tragedy. In the winter of 1991, driving on a highway not far from their house, her daughter, 23-year-old and pregnant, was killed in a fiery accident. A few months later, sitting numbly in a Bible study class one morning, Bradfield let her fingers wander up to the edge of her neck. A new grape-sized mass had appeared just above her collarbone. Her breast cancer had relapsed and metastasized, almost certainly a harbinger of death. Bradfield's oncologist in Burbank offered her more chemotherapy, but she declined it. She enrolled in an alternative herbal therapy program and bought a vegetable juicer and planned a trip to Mexico. When her oncologist asked if he could send samples of her breast cancer to Slaman's lab in UCLA for a second opinion, she agreed reluctantly. A faraway doctor performing unfamiliar tests on her tumor sample, she knew, could not possibly affect her. One afternoon in the winter of 1991, Bradfield received a phone call from Slaman. He introduced himself as a researcher who had analyzed her slides. Slaman told Bradfield about HER2. His tone changed, she recalled. Her tumor, he said, had one of the highest levels of amplified HER2 that he had ever seen. Slaman told her he was launching a trial of an antibody that bound HER2 and that she would be the ideal candidate for the new drug. Bradfield refused. I was at the end of my road, she said, and I had accepted what seemed inevitable. Slaman tried to reason with her for a while, but found her unbending. He thanked her for her consideration and rang off. Early the next morning, though, Slaman was back on the telephone. He apologized for the intrusion, but her decision had troubled him all night. Of all the variants of HER2 amplification that he had encountered, hers had been truly extraordinary. Bradfield's tumor was chock full of HER2, almost hypnotically drunk on the oncogene. He begged her once again to join his trial. Survivors look back and see omens, messages they missed, Joan Didion wrote. For Bradfield, Slaman's second phone call was an omen that was not missed. Something in the conversation pierced through a shield that she had drawn around herself. On a warm August morning in 1992, Bradfield visited Slaman in his clinic at UCLA. He met her in a hallway and led her to a room in the back. Under the microscope, he showed her the breast cancer that had been excised from her body, with its dark ringlets of HER2-labeled cells. On a whiteboard, he drew up a step-by-step picture of an epic scientific journey. He began with the discovery of Nu, its rediscovery in Ulrich's lab, the struggles to produce a drug, culminating in the antibodies stitched together so carefully by Shepard and Carter. Bradfield considered the line that stretched from oncogene to drug, and she agreed to join Slaman's trial. It was an extremely fortunate decision. In the 4 months between Slaman's phone call and the first infusion of Herceptin, Bradfield's tumor had erupted, spraying 16 new masses into her lung. And that's, another break that I did not realize because it was at the end of the page. But here goes. Wonderful shit. let's finish this chapter. I don't know if I'll keep on going on, especially this has been 1 hour and 11 minutes. I know my book report is tomorrow, but it's at 1:30, and I've got like free time all the way from like 12. Oh, that's not that really isn't much time. I was gonna say like 12 to 1:30, but yeah, I'll be fine. I'll be fine. I've got a train ride. I've got a train ride to do. That gives me another hour. So yeah, I'll be fine. I'll be fine. Don't worry about me. I just gotta read to like 470, not like 570, because 470 to 570 is it's the new stuff, which although I'd love to read it before the book report, I think it's physically impossible, to say the least. Okay, let's do this. 15 women, including Bradfield, enrolled in Slamin's trial at UCLA in 1992. The number would later be expanded to 37. The drug was given for 9 weeks in combination with cisplatin, a standard chemotherapy agent used to kill breast cancer cells, both delivered intravenously. As a matter of convenience, Slamin planned to treat all the women on the same day and in the same room. The effect was theatrical. This was a stage occupied by a beleaguered set of actors. Some women had begged and finagled their way into Slamin's trial through friends and relatives. Others, such as Bradfield, had been begged to join it. All of us knew that we were living on borrowed time, Bradfield said, and so we felt twice as alive and lived twice as fiercely. A Chinese woman in her 50s brought stash after stash of traditional herbs and salves that she swore had kept her alive thus far. She would take oncology's newest drug, Herceptin, only if she could also take its most ancient drugs with it. A frail, thin woman in her 30s recently relapsed with breast cancer after a bone marrow transplant glowered silently and intensely in a corner. Some treated their illness reverentially. Some were bewildered, some too embittered to care. A mother from Boston in her mid-50s cracked raunchy jokes about her cancer. The day-long drill of infusions and blood tests was exhausting. In the late evening, after all the tests, the women went their own ways. Bradford went home and prayed. Another woman soused herself with martinis. Interesting. The lump on Bradfield's neck, the only tumor in the group that could be physically touched, measured, and watched, became the compass for the trial. On the morning of the first intravenous infusion of the HER2 antibody, all the women came up to feel the lump one by one, running their hands across Bradfield's collarbone. It was a peculiarly intimate ritual that would be repeated every week. 2 weeks after the first dose of the antibody, when the group filed past Bradfield, touching the note again, the change was incontrovertible. Bradfield's tumor had softened and visibly shrunk. We began to believe that something was happening here, Bradfield recalled. Suddenly, the weight of our good fortune hit us. Not everyone was as fortunate as Bradfield. Exhausted and nauseous one evening, the young woman with relapsed metastatic cancer was unable to keep down the fluids needed to hydrate her body. She vomited through the night, and then, too tired to keep drinking and too sick to understand the consequences, fell back into sleep. She died of kidney failure the next week. Bradley's extraordinary response continued. When the CT scans were repeated 2 months into the trial, the tumor in her neck had virtually disappeared, and the lung metastases had also diminished both in number and size. The responses in many of the 13 other women were more ambiguous. At the 3-month midpoint of the trial, when Slamin reviewed the data with Genentech and the external trial monitors, tough decisions clearly needed to be made. Tumors had remained unchanged in size in some women, not shrunk but static. Was this to be counted as a positive response? Some women with bone metastases reported diminished bone pain, but pain could not objectively be judged. After a prolonged and bitter debate, the trial coordinator suggested dropping 7 women from the study because the responses could not be quantified. One woman discontinued the drug herself. Only 5 of the original cohort, including Bradfield, continued the trial to its 6-month endpoint. Embittered and disappointed, the others returned to their local oncologists, their hopes for a miracle drug again dashed. Barbara Bradfield finished 18 weeks of therapy in 1993. She survives today. A gray-haired woman with crystalline gray-blue eyes, she lives in the small town of Puyallup near Seattle, hikes in the nearby woods, and leads discussion groups for her church. She vividly remembers her days at the Los Angeles clinic, the half-lit room at the back where the nurses doused the drugs, the strangely intimate touch of the other woman feeling the node in her neck. And Slamin, of course. Dennis is my hero. She said, I refused his first phone call, but I have never ever refused him anything since that time. The animation and energy in her voice crackled across the phone line like an electrical current. She quizzed me about my research. I thanked her for her time, but she in turn apologized for the distraction. Get back to work, she said, laughing. There are people waiting for discoveries. That's very cool. And the end of that chapter. You know what time it is. Hell yeah. The next one is just 6 pages long. Do I want to do this? In fact, it's 5 pages long. I'll douse some more water and we'll briefly do it. So this would bring our progress to page 430 out of a required 470, and I can easily just do 40 pages on the train right there. Okay. Last chapter for today. Drugs, Bodies, and Proof. My voice, I swear, my voice is going to be dead tomorrow. More than just lost, it's going to be fucking dead. I can feel myself doing irreversible damage to my throat. Two quotes. Dying people don't have time or energy. We can't keep doing this one woman, one drug, one company at a time. And that's by Gracia Buffleben. Wonderful name. Second quote. It seemed as if we have entered a brave new world of precisely targeted, less toxic, more effective combined therapies. And that is from Breast Cancer Action newsletter in 2004. Let's go for it. By the summer of 1993, news of Slamin's early phase trial had spread like wildfire through the community of breast cancer patients, fanning out through official and unofficial channels. In waiting rooms, infusion centers, and oncologists' offices, patients spoke to other patients describing the occasional but unprecedented responses and remissions. Newsletters printed by breast cancer support groups whipped up a frenzy of hype and hope about Herceptin. Inevitably, a tinderbox of expectation was set to explode. The issue was compassionate use. HER2-positive breast cancer is one of the most fatal and rapidly progressing variants of the disease, and patients were willing to try any therapy that could produce a clinical benefit. Breast cancer activists pounded on Genentech's doors to urge the release of drugs to women with HER2-positive cancer who had failed other therapies. These patients, the activists argued, could not wait for the drug to undergo interminable testing. They wanted a potentially life-saving medicine now. True success happens, as one writer put it in 1995, only when these new drugs actually enter bodies. For Genentech, though, true success was defined by vastly different imperatives. Herceptin had not been approved by the FDA. It was a molecule in its infancy. Genentech wanted carefully executed early-phase trials, not just new drugs entering bodies, but carefully monitored drugs entering carefully monitored bodies in carefully monitored trials. For the next phase of Herceptin trials launched in 1993, Genentech wanted to stay small and focused. The number of women enrolled in these trials had been kept to an absolute minimum. 27 patients at Sloan Kettering, 16 at UCSF, and 39 at UCLA. A tiny cohort that the company intended to follow deeply and meticulously through time. "We do not provide compassionate use programs," Curd curtly told a journalist. Most doctors involved in the early phase trials agreed. "If you start making exceptions and deviating from your protocol," said Debbie Tripathi, one of the leaders of the UCSF trial, "then you get a lot of patients whose results are not going to help you understand whether a drug works or not. All you're doing is delaying being able to get it out into the public." Outside the cloisters laboratories of GreenTech, the controversy ignited a firestorm. San Francisco, of course, was no stranger to this issue of compassionate use versus focused research. In late 1980s, as AIDS had erupted in the city, filling up Paul Volberding's haunted Ward 5B with scores of patients, gay men had coalesced into groups such as ACT UP to demand speedier access to drugs, in part through compassionate use programs. Breast cancer activists saw a grim reflection of their own struggle in these early battles. As one newsletter put it, "Why do women dying of breast cancer have so much trouble getting experimental drugs that could extend their lives?" For years, AIDS activists had been negotiating with drug companies and the FDA to obtain new HIV drugs while the therapies were still in clinical trials. Surely women with metastatic breast cancer for whom standard treatment have failed should know about and have access to compassionate use programs for experimental drugs. Or, as another writer put it, "Scientific uncertainty is no excuse for inaction. We cannot wait for proof." And that was the first break, so you know what to do. Boom! Oh, resplendent, resonant sounds there. Martine Nelson, for one, certainly could not afford to wait for proof. An outgoing dark-haired gynecologist in California, Nelson had discovered a malignant mass in her breast in 1987, when she was just 33. She had had a mastectomy and multiple cycles of chemo, and then returned to practicing medicine in the San Francisco clinic. The tumor had disappeared. The scars had healed. Nelson thought she might have been cured. In 1993, 6 years after her initial surgery, Nelson noticed that the scar in her breast had begun to harden. She waved it away, but the hardened line of tissue outlining her breast was relapsed breast cancer, worming its way insidiously along the scar lines and coalescing into small matted masses in her breast. Nelson, who compulsively followed the clinical literature on breast cancer, had heard of HER2. Reasoning presciently that her tumor might be HER2 positive, she tried to have her own specimen tested for the gene. But Nelson soon found herself inhabiting a Kafkaesque nightmare. Her HMO insisted that because Herceptin was in investigational trials, testing the tumor for HER2 was useless. Genentech insisted that without HER2 status confirmed, giving her access to Herceptin was untenable. In the summer of 1993, with Nelson's cancer advancing daily and spewing out metastases into her lung and bone marrow, the struggle took an urgent political turn. Nelson contacted the Breast Cancer Action Project, a local San Francisco organization connected with ACT UP, to help her get someone to test her tumor and obtain Herceptin for compassionate use. BCA, working through its activist networks, asked several laboratories in and around San Francisco to test Nelson's tumor. In October 1994, the tumor was finally tested for HER2 expression at UCSF. It was strikingly HER2 positive. She was an ideal candidate for the drug, but the news came too late. 9 days later, still awaiting Herceptin approval from Genentech, Marty Nelson drifted into a coma and died. She was 41 years old. And that was another break. Hell yeah. We're on a roll with these strikes, with these bells, with these tolls. For BCA activists, Nelson's death was a watershed event. Livid and desperate, a group of women from the BCA stormed through the Genentech campus on December 5, 1994, to hold a 15-car funeral procession for Nelson, with placards showing Nelson in her chemo turban before her death. The women shouted and honked their horns and drove their cars through the manicured lawns. Gracia Bufflebin, a nurse with breast cancer and one of the most outspoken leaders of the BCA, parked her car outside one of the main buildings and handcuffed herself to the steering wheel. A furious researcher stumbled out of the lab buildings and shouted, "I'm a scientist working on the AIDS cure. Why are you here? You are making too much noise." It was a statement that epitomized the vast and growing rift between scientists and patients. Marty Nelson's funeral woke Genentech up to a new reality. Outrage, rising to a crescendo, threatened to spiral into a public relations disaster. Genentech had a narrow choice. Unable to silence the activists, it was forced to join them. Even Kurd admitted, if somewhat begrudgingly, that the BCA was a tough group and their activism is not misguided. In 1995, a small delegation of Genentech scientists and executives flew to Washington to meet Francis Visco, the chair of the National Breast Cancer Coalition, a powerful national coalition of cancer activists, hoping to use the NBCC as a neutral intermediary between the company and the local breast cancer activists in San Francisco. Pragmatic, charismatic, and savvy, Visco, a former attorney, had spent nearly a decade immersed in the turbulent politics of breast cancer. Visco had a proposal for Genentech, but her terms were inflexible. Genentech had to provide an expanded access program for Herceptin. The program would allow oncologists to treat patients outside clinical trials. In return, the National Breast Cancer Coalition would act as a go-between for Genentech and its embittered and alienated community of cancer patients. Visco offered to join the planning committee for the Phase 3 trials of Herceptin and to help recruit patients for the trial using the NBCC's extensive network. For Genentech, this was a long overdue education. Rather than running trials on breast cancer patients, the company learned to run trials with breast cancer patients. It was an uneasy triangle of forces: academic researchers, the pharmaceutical industry, and patient advocates, united by a deadly disease. Genentech's next phase of trials involved large-scale, randomized studies on thousands of women with metastatic HER2-positive cancer, comparing Herceptin treatment against placebo treatment. Visco sent out newsletters from the NBCC to patients using the coalition's enormous listservs. Kay Dickerson, a coalition member and an epidemiologist, joined the Data Safety and Monitoring Board of the trial, underscoring the new partnership between Genentech and the NBCC. It's like the NBC, except with cancer in it. The extra C. Between academic medicine and activism. And an all-star team of breast oncologists were assembled to run the trial. Larry Norton from Sloan Kettering, Karen Attman from Columbia, Daniel Hayes from Harvard, and of course, Slaman from UCLA. In 1995, empowered by the very forces that it had resisted for so long, Genentech launched 3 independent Phase 3 trials to test Herceptin. The most pivotal of the 3 was a trial labeled 648, randomizing women newly diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer to standard chemotherapy alone versus chemotherapy with Herceptin added. Trial 648 was launched in 150 breast cancer clinics around the world. The trial would enroll 469 women and cost Genentech $15 million to run. In May 1998, oh right, this was a break. My god, we're already 1.5 hours in. Ooh, wonderful stuff. That was the best one yet. In May 1998, 18,000 cancer specialists flocked to Los Angeles to attend the 34th meeting of the American Society of Clinical Oncology, where Genentech would unveil the data from the Herceptin trials, including Trial 648. On Sunday, May 17th, the third day of the meeting, an expectant audience of thousands piled into the stuffy central amphitheater at the convention center to attend a special session dedicated to HER2/neu in breast cancer. Slaman was slated to be the last speaker, a coil of nervous energy with a characteristic twitch in his mustache. He stood up at the podium. Clinical presentations at ASCO are typically sanitized and polished, with blue and white PowerPoint slides depicting the bottom line message using survival curves and statistical analyses. But Slaman began, relishing this pivotal moment, not with numbers and statistics, but with 49 smudgy bands on a gel run by one of his undergraduate students in 1987. Oncologists slowed down their scribbling. Reporters squinted their eyes to see the bands on the gel. That gel, he reminded his audience, had identified a gene with no pedigree, no history, no function, no mechanism. It was nothing more than an isolated amplified signal in a fraction of breast cancer cases. Slaman had gambled the most important years of his scientific life on these bands. Others had joined the gamble: Ulrich, Shepard, Carter, Botstein, and Levinson, Visco and the activists, pharma executives and clinicians, and Genentech. The trial results to be announced that afternoon resembled the result of that gamble. But Slaman he couldn't rush the endpoint of the journey without reminding everyone in the room of the fitful, unsanitized history of the drug. Slaman paused for a theatrical moment before revealing the results of the trial. In the pivotal 648 study, 469 women had received standard cytotoxic chemotherapy, either adriamycin and cytoxin in combination, or Taxol, and were randomized to receive either Herceptin or a placebo. In every conceivable index of response, women treated with the addition of Herceptin had shown a clear and measurable benefit. Response rates to standard chemotherapy had moved up 150%. Tumors had shrunk in half the women treated with Herceptin compared to a third of women in the control group. In the control arm, the progression of breast cancer had been delayed from 4 to 7.5 months. In patients with tumors heavily resistant to the standard adriamycin and cytoxin regimen, the benefit had been the most marked. The combination of Herceptin and Taxol had increased response rates to nearly 50%, a rate unheard of in recent clinical experience. The survival rate would also follow this trend. Women treated with Herceptin lived 4 or 5 months longer than women in the control group. At face value, some of these gains might have seemed small in absolute terms, life extended by only 4 months. But the women enrolled in these initial trials were patients with large-stage metastatic cancers, often heavily pretreated with standard chemotherapies and refractory to all drugs, women carrying the worst and most aggressive variants of breast cancer. The true measure of Herceptin's efficacy would lie in the treatment of treatment-naive patients, women diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer who had never received any prior treatment. In 2003, 2 enormous multinational studies were launched to test Herceptin in early-stage breast cancer in treatment-naive patients. In one of the studies, Herceptin treatment increased breast cancer survival at 4 years by a striking 18% over the placebo group. The second study, although stopped earlier, showed a similar magnitude of benefit. When the trials were statistically combined, overall survival in women treated with Herceptin was increased by 33%, a magnitude unprecedented in the history of chemotherapy for HER2-positive cancer. The results, one oncologist wrote, were simply stunning, not evolutionary, but revolutionary. The rational development of molecularly targeted therapies points the direction towards continued improvement in breast cancer therapy. Other targets and other agents will follow. And that's our final break, and our final break of the night. Watch out. Alright, half a page left. On the evening of May 17, 1998, after Slaman had announced the result of the 648 study to a stunned audience at the ASCO meeting, Genentech threw an enormous cocktail party at the Hollywood Terrace, an open-air restaurant nestled in the hills of Los Angeles. Wine flowed freely, and the conversation was light and breezy. Just a few days earlier, the FDA had reviewed the data from the 3 Herceptin trials, including Slaman's study, and was on the verge of fast-tracking the approval of Herceptin. It was a poignant posthumous victory for Marty Nelson. The drug that would likely have saved her life would become accessible to all breast cancer patients, no longer reserved for clinical trials or compassionate use alone. The company, Robert Bazell, the journalist, wrote, invited all the investigators, as well as most of Genentech's HER2 team. The activists came too, Marilyn McGregor and Bob Irwin from San Francisco, and Fran Visco from the NBCC. The evening was balmy, clear, and spectacular. The warm orange glow of the setting sun over the San Fernando Valley set the tone of the festivities. Everyone at the party would celebrate an enormous success. Women's lives would be saved and a huge fortune would be made. Only one person was conspicuously missing from the party, Dennis Slaman. Having spent the afternoon planning the next phase of Herceptin trials with breast oncologists at ASCO, Slaman had jumped into his rundown Nissan and driven home. Ta-da! And we only have 2 chapters left, I believe. Right? Oh, 3. Yes. And then it would go into the recent stuff. But quite frankly, I can always do it after the book report, just for completeness' sake.